The death of a centrist and beloved statesman casts into stark relief the politics of the day. What lessons can we still learn from former Governor Bob Graham? To discuss that, we're joined by his former co-author, speechwriter, and press secretary, Jacksonville attorney Chris Hand. Welcome, Chris.
Good morning, Ann.
So, Chris, first of all, our condolences. I know that you worked with Bob Graham for a long time. How did you meet him, and what was he like?
Well, I feel like I met him in the way that many Floridians did, which is I sort of grew up under the leadership of Bob Graham. When he was elected governor when I was 5 or 6 years old, and sort of spent most of my upbringing with Bob Graham as either the governor or the U.S. Senator from Florida. I think when I was in eighth grade is when he was elected to the Senate. And as someone who was interested in government and politics from an early age, he was the elected official that I most looked up to and that I most admired. So, when I was in college and decided that what I wanted to do after college was spend some time working on Capitol Hill, there was no question about where I wanted to be, and that was working for U.S. Senator Bob Graham. So after a brief stint working for another senator, after somewhat persistently stopping by his office all the time to see if there were vacancies, was, fortunate enough to have one of the luckiest breaks of my life, and that was the opportunity to join his staff. So I met him personally for the first time in February of 1996, but felt like I had known him for a long time before that because of his ability to relate to Floridians and establish relationships with Floridians, in his roles as governor and senator.
And that's a feeling and emotion he left a lot of people with. As you said, you've been attending a lot of events around, commemorating him, including his lying in state in Tallahassee. A lot of people felt like they had a personal connection.
Well, and that was very much because of how he approached his role as a public servant. There was very little, in terms of his job that he loved more than connecting with Floridians, learning from Floridians, working with them in their jobs. As you know, he did 408 work days alongside Floridians at different jobs in the state throughout his career. And that was really at the core of who he was as a public official, staying connected to the constituents he represented, taking their ideas and trying to implement them in either Tallahassee or Washington, and just sort of truly becoming friends with them. And I cannot count the number of times that Senator Graham and I would be in a restaurant or some other public place and someone would recognize him, come up, tell their story, and he would sit and listen and ask questions, ultimately take down their contact information, and they would invariably get a letter or some other kind of communication from him. He always valued those learning opportunities and those opportunities to build personal relationships and friendships with Floridians. It's not easy to do in a state that is now 20 million people, but Bob Graham was very committed to those sorts of working and personal relationships.
His death was covered by pretty much every national outlet, of course. One obituary I read, I think it was the Washington Post, he was described as, quote, a consensus-building governor who became one of the most popular politicians in the state's history. And I think that phrase alone is an indicator of just kind of how far we've come, because really, viewing our politicians today as statesmen is something that it's rare. Graham had an 83% approval rating when he left office.
Well, and I think that reflects a lot of aspects of kind of, again, how he approached his job as governing. He was never partisan. I mean, one of the first things he told me the first week I was working in his office in Washington was, the way we do things here is we look for opportunities to work across party lines and work with Republicans because we want to be consensus building here. We might be Democrats, but at the end of the day, we're representing the entire population here in Florida. And so we want to make sure that we work with anybody who's going to help us do that. And he was truly committed to that. He had during the time I worked for him in the United States Senate, had a very close working relationship and personal friendship with Connie Mack, his Republican colleague from Florida. They were truly friends and worked together very effectively on a number of issues. Just one example, during that period of time, Bill Clinton was president. There was, for parts of that or most of that, a Republican majority in the House and Senate. One of the issues, an issue we still see today, was the issue of getting judges approved or getting new judgeships approved by the United States Senate and the House so Florida could meet its ever-growing population. Many states struggle with that. One that didn't was Florida because Bob Graham and Connie Mack had such a close relationship. They involved each other in their judicial selection processes and in the process of getting these nominees. Because of that collaboration, Florida was in a much better place. That's how he approached his job at every rung of public service, whether it was in the legislature or governor or a U.S. Senate, wanting to build consensus, work across party lines, and be forward thinking. And I think all of that helped him be very effective and, develop that level of support from Floridians.
And the praise that he received since his death from Republicans, I thought it was very interesting. Former Mayor John Payton, a Republican, called him, quote, genuine, authentic, practical, transparent, ethical, and the standard bearer for what a statesman could and should be. Really remarkable praise in what is a hyper-partisan era. But it's worth remembering, John Payton's father sold to the state the Guana property that is, that giant preserve in northeast St. Johns County. That was because of Bob Graham.
Well, it's one of the many monuments to Bob Graham that exist here in Northeast Florida, Ann, and you're absolutely right. Almost, exactly 40 years ago, in this period in the 1980s, the state of Florida, when Senator Graham was governor at that point, and the Gate Corporation, led by Herb Payton, reached an agreement to preserve Guana Preserve in sort of the Ponte Vedra, St. Johns County area. For anyone who hasn't spent time at Guana, I highly encourage it. I like to hike there and think of Senator Graham every time I do. That was a remarkable example of public-private cooperation on environmental preservation, but it's just one of several. For example, if you go into the northern part of our Northeast Florida region, Big Talbot Island State Park, that also exists because when Senator Graham was Governor Graham, he worked to preserve that for future generations. So those are just a couple of the many monuments here in Northeast Florida to Senator Graham's work, his dedication, and his effectiveness.
Well, I want to move on now to a topic that seems bound to break any day now. The city and the Jaguars have long been saying May was the month for an agreement to renovate the stadium, that it would come before the Jacksonville City Council in May. So May's here. What happens now, Chris?
Well, what we're told is going to happen is that at some point these agreements are going to be brought before the city council. The city's lead negotiator, Mike Weinstein, has said that it will not be an agreement. It will be more like 7 or 8 agreements, hundreds of pages for this deal, which could be somewhere in total, including the city's contribution, in the range of $1.5 billion or so. So the process will be like there have been for other agreements the city has had with the Jaguars. The mayor's office will likely bring that to the city council, and then the council will have a period of review. We've also heard from Council President Ron Salem that there will be some opportunity for public input into that process as well. But I anticipate this takes at least 60 days for this to go through the city council, and we'll see what the final result is there.
Now, you've been through a negotiation process when you were chief of staff in the city with the Jaguars, negotiating, different kinds of deals, including scoreboards and the pool. And why does it make sense to you that it would be 7 agreements? Why might there be so many different agreements?
Because it could cover a lot of different aspects. One is going to be a funding agreement, obviously, in terms of how does the city fund. It's not clear, and I guess whenever the deal is announced, we'll find this out. The city's share is probably going to be somewhere between $750 million and $1 billion. So one agreement is probably a funding agreement. There's probably another agreement that relates to the naming and signage on the new stadium. Probably another one still that could be the lease. Obviously, a crucial part of this deal is, will the Jaguars lease be extended by the life of the funding of the new stadium another 30, 35 years? So there are a lot of different moving parts to this. But at the end of the day, I think taxpayers are primarily interested in a variety of questions. One being, what's the cost going to be? And what are the benefits of that investment? And what are the potential opportunity costs, the trade-offs of those investments? How might this affect the city's ability to fund other operational and capital priorities going forward?
The big question. If you're just joining us, we're catching up on what's happening in state and local politics, as we do each month with Jacksonville attorney and local government expert Chris Hand. You can join our conversation live on air by calling 904-549-2937. You can also email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org, or you can reach out on social media. So as you noted, City Council President Ron Salem said there might be 2 weeks of meetings, public meetings on this issue. Is that enough time for the public to weigh in on $1 billion plus possibly city investment. And would their comments in such a brief period actually make any difference?
It feels like a very succinct period of time for, public comment on a deal that could have taxpayer impacts of between 750 and $1 billion. This is one of the most significant infrastructure investments the city of Jacksonville will have ever made. Remember, we're talking about potentially $1 billion with a B. That is inevitably going to have operational and capital budget impacts over time that could impact other initiatives and priorities the city funds. So 2 weeks of meetings feels like that might be, like I said, a little overly succinct when, given the scale of this investment, this is probably an opportunity to maybe have as many as 14 meetings, one in each council district, where the city says, look, here's exactly what the deal is going to be. Here's what we see as the benefits of it. Here are what some of the trade-offs might be. Having a very candid conversation with citizens about this is what the kind of impact's going to be over time, and giving citizens an opportunity to weigh in. I think that's always a good idea, not only because citizens are at the top of the organizational chart at the city of Jacksonville, but they are much more likely to buy in or ultimately invest in this deal if they've had an opportunity to hear about it and provide feedback to it.
I heard you mention that earlier when we were talking before the program about the citizens being at the top of the organizational chart. And I'm not sure people understand that. I'm not sure I understand that.
Well, at the end of the day, we are in a democratic small d government here where, the consolidation was founded on citizen votes. It was created by the citizenry of Jacksonville. So at the end of the day, who is supposed to be at the top of the organizational chart is the nearly 1 million people living in the consolidated city of Jacksonville. Below them is all the elected officials. I think about this a lot. Senator Graham always talked about how the most important role in democracy was that of citizen. He and I actually wrote a couple of books on that subject about the importance of citizen engagement. So at the top of any governmental organizational chart is the citizens who live in a particular community and elect the officials to govern.
We are expecting that a $1 billion possible jail is also in the pipeline. It is, and I know, we don't know the funding source for whatever this proposal will be when it hits the public eye, but does the city even have anywhere near enough resources to finance two essential, like, kind of $1 billion projects simultaneously, given all of the other needs, all of the other infrastructure demands that the city has?
That's an excellent question that the city is going to need to answer over the course of this process, because obviously the Jaguars agreement, whatever that ultimately looks like, is going to have to be weighed against some of those other priorities. You mentioned the idea of building a new Duval County jail. Another one that's crucially important is the long-delayed, unfulfilled promises of consolidation, which means that in many neighborhoods across the community, there's very few neighborhoods in the consolidated city of Jacksonville that aren't touched by this in some way. There are decades-old, 55-plus year infrastructure needs that have still not been met, whether that's converting from septic tanks to central sewer, whether that's paving or illuminating streets, whether that's building sidewalks, whether that's making sure neighborhoods have potable drinking water, and that's just a few examples. We have pressing infrastructure needs around this community. So all of that has to be weighed in concert with the stadium and the jail. And I think even more important, why the city have a robust schedule of community conversation so people can hear how this fits into the overall kind of infrastructure needs of the city.
Well, we're sure to revisit this issue when, and expected to be soon. We'll hear some announcement about this. I want to move on to the topic of ballot initiatives that are going to be coming before voters in November. There are 6 currently teed up. There may be more, and we can talk about that in a minute. But some of these are put on the ballot by voters, and some are put on by lawmakers. Is there any traditionally or fundamentally any kind of difference about the kinds of amendments that each of those groups tends to put on the ballot?
Well, I think there's a big difference in the process to get those amendments to the ballot. Obviously, the legislature can do that with supermajorities in both houses, so that happens, relatively. It's a relatively straightforward process. The process of getting a citizen initiative on the ballot is much more difficult because it obviously involves collecting a certain number of petition signatures, which is a very expensive process. And in recent years, there have been some changes in the way those are regulated that I think have made it even more challenging for some of those groups who want to put issues on the ballot. Has to go through a Supreme Court review to make sure that they believe the ballot initiative meets what's called the single subject rule and doesn't violate other constitutional norms. So it's a very onerous process. And by the way, when you get to the end of that and you actually do get your proposed constitutional amendment on the ballot, it's not just a simple majority to pass it. It's 60% plus one of that. So the two methods, one is much more straightforward. The other one is more complicated. But at the end of the day, they all present initiatives or amendments for voters to consider. And as you say, as of right now, we have 6 on the November ballot.
One of the big ones is the abortion amendment 4. It would enshrine the right to abortion in the state's constitution up to the point of viability at 24 weeks. That's going to be driving a lot of the discussion around Florida politics for the next several months.
Well, with everything on the ballot, the presidential contest, a U.S. Senate contest, I think it's increasingly seems likely that the most intensely contested issue on the ballot is going to be the reproductive choice or the abortion amendment. Obviously, on May 1st, just in the last week, Florida law changed, and so abortion is now banned after 6 weeks of pregnancy, except for a few exceptions. The amendment would shift this back to what was largely in place before the Supreme Court passed the Dodd's decision. It would establish a timing standard of viability, that abortions prior to viability were legal, and then after legal, necessary to protect the health of the patient involved as well. So that's going to be on the ballot. There's going to be intense activity around that. I think there's a perception that Republican candidates have a bit of an advantage in some of the, like I said, the presidential contest and the U.S. Senate contest. But I think it's this particular amendment that's going to attract tons of attention, resources. People coming to the state to campaign will be for that reproductive choice amendment.
And so there is discussion of a possible special session Memorial Day weekend around that time for the legislature to go back and reconvene. One of the reasons that they're thinking about or talking about is kind of immigration based, to pass a law similar to what Texas has, allowing local officials to arrest people who are in the country illegally. But behind that, there's this other discussion that's happening about a possible additional abortion amendment that could be introduced by lawmakers. What can you tell us about what that might look like and why that might be being discussed?
The speculation has been the legislature could come back into special session, which can happen in one of two ways. Either the governor can order, actually one of several ways, but the two most used for the most part, the governor can call them back into special session, and the two presiding officers, the Senate president and the House Speaker, can jointly agree to call them back into session. There's been some speculation that they would bring them back to put another abortion amendment on the ballot, one that might say, rather than establish a viability, have a certain number of weeks, or there are folks who are concerned that that might be designed to sort of cloud the issue before voters. In the last 24 hours, the chances of a special session seem to have diminished. The governor was asked yesterday whether he plans to bring back a special session. He essentially said no. He's like, look, I think he'd like to see the legislature do more on immigration, but said, right now we're sort of focused on the budget. So that seemed to diminish some of the likelihood of a special session. Apparently the state Senate president has told reporters when asked that that's not really in her plans as well. So we'll have to see. The talk was that might occur around Memorial Day. But again, in the last 24 hours, it seems like some of the momentum behind that idea has dissipated, and it may not happen.
Well, that's interesting. So another amendment that is on that will go before voters is one that was brought by lawmakers. It would change the way that campaigns are financed in the state when it comes to the governor races and the state cabinet candidates. Can you tell us what is motivating this change and what it would do?
Sure. So in 1998, voters passed a constitutional amendment that provides for public financing of the governor's race and the other cabinet races. So Attorney General, Chief Financial Officer, Commissioner of Agriculture and Consumer Services, and essentially provides matching funds from the state for candidates for those offices who qualify for the matching program, but subject to a cap on the amount that their campaign can spend. And the idea of that amendment was to try and, as much as possible, diminish the influence of money in the process, try to limit the amount that these candidates were spending. there have been folks for years who've been opposed to any public financing of campaigns who have attempted to reverse this provision. It was an attempt in 2010 that was not successful. So again, part of this, part of the motivation behind this amendment is a desire to just get the state out of the business altogether of funding these kind of matching funds. There are others who have said, no, this is probably actually controlled some of the money that's in elections. We'll have to see in November whether 60% plus one of voters agree with this amendment.
The idea of observing the cap was sort of, as I recall, first thrown out under Governor Rick Scott, who had sort of so much money that he was able to bankroll his own campaign and wasn't willing, didn't need the match, and also didn't want to be constrained by that cap that the match requires.
Yeah, the cap is not on, for First Amendment and other reasons, anyone's self-funding of their campaign. It also does not affect some of the outside committees, whether they're PCs or others, that now where a lot of campaign spending occurs. So, again, this was an effort back in 1998 to change that. We're now at this point, almost 26 years after that, and so we'll have to see whether voters take a different position than they did when this was on the ballot then.
I just want to read an email that we got from Javon. It says the city and residents would want a greater return on investment from spending $1 billion on its own facilities, parks, and riverfront. One day, I'm a day one Jaguars fan, but let the billionaires boys club pay for their own toys. Not an uncommon sentiment, I would say, in the city of Jacksonville. We know that polling has kind of upheld that. Another issue that is going to be before voters has to do with fishing and hunting, and this one is interesting. It would enshrine a right to fish and hunt in the Constitution. It is put on the ballot by lawmakers, but backed by a lot of outdoors groups. One of the things that it says is not only would the right to fish and hunt be preserved in the Constitution, but it would be preserved forever as a right and preferred means of responsibly managing wildlife. Is the preferred means language problematic at all?
I think that has been controversial among some preservation groups. And just to be very clear, the right to hunt and fish is already enshrined in Florida law. It's from a statutory standpoint. This would take it to a higher level of enshrinement and put it in the state constitution. But I think to the extent, and I don't anticipate widespread opposition to this amendment as we sit here today, but I think to the extent that there's been any concern, it has touched on that language, and some preservation groups have wondered, is that going to, preservation lands out there, is that going to impact kind of other environmental or preservation goals on that land? So we'll see if that blossoms into full-scale opposition to this amendment. It has not occurred just yet, but we still have a number of months before the November elections.
So there are also ballot amendments that will be making school board elections, would make school board elections partisan. It would provide for a larger property tax break for people with homestead exemptions. It would make marijuana legal from a recreational standpoint. And those are all things that we'll probably be discussing in the months ahead. But I want to at least briefly touch on the school board search for a superintendent. So yesterday, the Duval County School Board narrowed down to 2. They're finalists in their superintendent search. This is their second attempt to search. The first time they didn't get enough qualified applicants. How do you feel about the current pool of applicants and the process in terms of finding somebody who is up to the task?
Well, as we know, this is take 2 of this process. During the academic year, the Duval County School Board did an initial search, which I think only attracted 5 or 6 candidates total. So they decided to kind of shelve that search and start anew, have one that this time has been led by the Florida School Boards Association that produced, somewhere in the range of 20 candidates. They narrowed it down to 5 semifinalists, have now narrowed it down to 2 finalists. One who was most recently the superintendent of the Lee County Schools in Southwest Florida, and another who is the chief of staff at the Loudoun County Schools in the Washington, D.C. suburbs. So, again, this is another opportunity for citizen engagement. I believe this coming Monday, the 13th, and that evening at Everbank Field, the Duval County Schools are hosting a community forum with the 2 finalists and the candidates. That is an excellent opportunity for citizens to show up, attempt to ask questions, try to find out where these 2 potential superintendents stand on the many crucial issues that are going to be facing the Duval County Public Schools in the years to come.
And so many issues. So that public meet and greet opportunity is, as you said, Monday, May 13th. It's from 6 to 8 at Everbank Stadium. I just want to ask briefly, one of those two candidates has a recommendation from the head of the schools in Florida, Manny Diaz. Does that tip the scales in his favor?
That'll be very interesting to see how, those kind of factors. Obviously, this has been a sort of unprecedented time in public education, particularly with the relationship between the State Department of Education and a variety of individual school districts around the state. It'll be interesting to see how those sorts of factors kind of play into this. I think important to remember, though, that this is really, at the end of the day, basic math. There are 7 school board members. In order to be selected as a school superintendent, they need the support of 4 of those school board members. It's always preferable if you can have consensus, if you can have 6 or 7 of the school board vote on that. But, there's a lot of 4-3 votes in this day and age in the school board. So it's whichever candidate can attract 4 votes who will be the next Duval County school superintendent.
Well, Chris Hand, thank you so much for coming on the program. We love seeing you every month.
Great to see you, and look forward to seeing you next month.